thank you everybody to be present today, and we start this last session of the Olympic Games and Global City Conference in Paris, but in internet for the large majority. This afternoon we will talk from Tokyo to start with Naomi, Hanakata, and Filippo Bignami, and the games in general, not only in Tokyo. And we will after that talk with Professor John Lauermann about mega event and gentrification evidence from American cities. And I will continue by a presentation about the games in Paris and the different scales where the games are organized in the case of Paris 2024. And we will finish by a presentation from Greg Andranovich and Matthew Burbank about Los Angeles 2028. And I think they will join us at the end because they will start their presentation at 8 in the morning in California. I think it is 5 in the morning in California now. So they are not now connected. So thank you everybody to be here. And I will now let the floor to Naomi, Hanakata, and Dr. Filippo Bignami for their presentation. Thank you to be here and have a good presentation.
Thank you so much, Alexandre. Can you see our screen? Yes, great. Okay, Filippo, I give the word to you. You start.
Yes. So thank you, Alexandre, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us in sharing our piece of research and piece of project with you. So thank you to you and to the organizers of this excellent conference. So we then go through our presentation by saying that basically we base our hints and our input on a project that we are running together in Tokyo. So this project is a small size project, let's say, granted from the ETH Switzerland. It's a bilateral project that can count on partners, of course, SUPSI, which is coordinating, which is represented by me actually, then University of Tsukuba in Tokyo, University of Singapore represented by Naomi, and New York University, in which Professor Christopher Gaffney participated. So it was planned to run through the 2020, but of course, due to the postponing of the games, also we asked a postponement of the project. So the project is still running. Basically, TOT project focus on, of course, Tokyo Olympics, trying to delve into these Olympics through the lens of the urban transformation that is implied and is occurring in Tokyo, and trying in the same time to enlarge the vision and trying to set this issue of urban transformation and therefore implication on citizenship issues also on other mega events. That is to say, we try to, let's say, put in dialogue the Tokyo urban transformation and legacy, of course, of Olympics with other mega events. So now I leave the floor to Naomi to go through the presentation.
Thank you, Filippo. Yeah, I'll try to stick within the time. Let me check. Okay. Yeah. So the conversation we're trying to build, as Filippo said, is not only between Olympic cities, but also between Olympic Games and mega projects and the role of mega projects as such, because what we are observing is that particularly core city areas are increasingly determined by single mega projects, whether they are temporary, like Olympic Games, or other events, or more kind of lastingly from the outset, lasting large-scale urban mega projects, such as, for example, Luzazui in Shanghai, Marina Bay in Singapore, but also, of course, one of the, in fact, in the research that I've been doing, the mother of Grand Projet, La Défense in Paris, and new ones like King's Cross in London, you may know. They all share that they're comprehensively planned and realized in one go, and maybe most importantly, owned or at least supervised by a single urban actor. And through that constellation, these projects become extremely powerful in two ways. Firstly, through the governing bodies of such a project. In the case of the Tokyo Olympics, it's of course the IOC, but then also the Tokyo Olympic Committee and the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, in exactly that order: IOC, TOCOG, and the local government. And secondly, they become extremely powerful through the projects themselves and the capacity of these projects to transform the urban condition, not just the sites, but usually the city at large and the global perception of these cities. So while I think mega projects are consistently and of course also rightfully criticized for top-down decision-making processes and non-inclusive practices, they are nonetheless very efficient vehicles for responding to changing needs, leveraging the efficacy of new forms of urban making and generating innovative scales and related impacts of urban development within the city. Now, Tokyo in many ways is still an exception in that sense, because we don't find that many mega projects aside also from the Olympic venues in Tokyo. As you may know, there is of course the Marunouchi, the central business district, which is one large grand projet, and then a few smaller ones like the Roppongi Hills or Midtown. But they still, these kind of development strategies, these kind of development logics still form in a way an anomaly within the city of Tokyo, which is still largely defined by very fine-grained and disjoint urban development practices, or to put it differently, without any grand design or consistent strategy or urban planning scheme in the largest city. Now, using mega events as a pretext for urban development is per se, I think, nothing bad, rather the opposite, right? It is necessary to have a strategy beyond or behind the creation of Olympic Games for a transformation of the city. But I do think it becomes an issue if there is yet another layer of pretext, meaning the opportunities arising from an occasion like Olympic Games, and which are communicated to the public, differ from the actual motivation. And the case of Tokyo now presents us with a very unique, I believe, and extremely complex, multi-layered of different pretext narratives that has been built up over 16 years, really, through the two bidding phases and the postponement. So first we are dealing with the bid, or there's the narrative, the pretext for the 2016 games. That was one of sustainability games, the transitioning towards an economic and social sustainability as a mature city. It was the idea of becoming a role model city, especially for other Asian cities, as a highly urbanized area with super aging population and a mature economy. But of course, the reality, not of course, but one of the realities really that was driven by Ishihara, the mayor, the governor at the time, was to redevelop the waterfront area, the waterfront subcenter of Tokyo Bay, which has now hosted the athlete town and a few venues. And it was an agenda that was on the table since the 1990s, but never really pushed forward successfully. So that was Ishihara's mission at the time. Then for the 2020 games, and after revision of the Basic Acts in Sports in 2011, the narrative forbidding was elevated to a national strategy and a national mission of recovery after the triple catastrophe that had happened in the meantime, and that happened under Prime Minister Abe. However, I think we can still say the main concern really was a long-term revitalization of Tokyo Center. And lastly, the last kind of layer of pretext, if you will, is the one that happened after the postponement of the 2020 Games, and when the IOC insisted on holding the Games despite protests and international health concerns for the sake of global solidarity. So with that, we end up with an extremely complex overlay of multiple agendas and pretexts from which the urban transformation on the ground, I think, became increasingly disjoint and carried out in many ways very independently. And with that, I pass on to Filippo.
Filippo, you need to put your mic.
Yes, thank you. Now I think that you can hear me well.
Perfect.
So I try to stick to the time, so I try to stay really in 5 minutes. So I continue Naomi discourse, considering that basically we are elaborating on some points in terms of results from the TOT project outcomes and outputs. So the first important one is the one that Naomi pointed out on the issue of pretext and its development. And another important point we think that is worth to be elaborated and developed is the role of platforms. In terms of role of platforms, we consider that we start from the consideration, of course, that each Olympics and also mega events are in a way or in another a showcase for the urban areas and the countries, of course, to demonstrate and to take a role or to regain a role in the global scenario. For example, a powerful example of this phenomena is the case of Rio de Janeiro, which established a 10-year strategy of staging mega events exactly as a powerful showcase to become a sort of Paris in the tropical area, mostly failing, but it's another discourse. So we consider that in any case the role of platforms during the mega events like Olympics, it's a powerful driver because is inflated and is accelerated by the Olympics. In other terms, all our urban areas, but also it's a planetary pathway, are inflated and are slowly but steadily governed and administered by platforms. In the case of mega events, this trend is deeply accelerated. Why? We think that in particular in the case of Tokyo, the construction of a new urban innovation scenario based on platform has been an important point. In which term? We think that we can envisage some drivers in this extensive use of platforms in the urban area. Particularly, I will be really short, particularly in, for example, environmental technologies, for example, to control pollution, to distribute energy, to administer services connected with energies and so on. Then another important point is the use of platform for the transport system implementation. Then another important point is the use of platforms merged with sport technologies for managing sport events, sport facilities, infrastructure, and so on. Then, of course, there is also the important discourse on ICT and platforms in terms of generation, access, use, administration, sharing of data. So this is, of course, another big point. Then there is another important point on the aspect of security, policing, and safety administration of the areas. So we think that this role of platforms during the mega event is an important element, an important driver influencing and amending the several dimensions of citizenship, of course, because this use of platforms can create additional fault lines, additional watersheds in terms of inclusion and exclusion, in terms of access or not access, in terms of privileged access to some areas, for example, or forbidding other areas. So this can represent, of course, a positive, but also a dangerous aspects, this use of platforms. Also because we can see that probably this extensive use of platforms is implemented during the Olympics, but is lasting much more later and much more in the long term after the end of the Olympics, creating and depicting a sort of techno-political scenario. Thank you, Naomi, if you can skip. So done this, done in a road and a short way, these 2 points, we would like to share with you our vision in terms of project continuation to some extent and project outlook. So by this project, we try to investigate, therefore, the role of urban intervention and as a connection and a cause and a causing element for urban transformation and citizenship. So in other terms, the changing in the urban area that occur in connection with the mega events create long-term impacts in terms of course, urban production and citizenship. Another important point that we would like to continue to develop is to feed a set of case studies of mega events, trying to create a dialogue one each other to kickstart and to continue, of course, a discourse with urban actors involved in the making of such event, to inform them and to provide them with hints, informations, sharing some visions, and about understanding which are the implication of such mega event staging in order to share with a wider audience, in order to improve not only seeing the mega events as a per se moment, but trying to enlarge this vision. Then, of course, we would like to share building a network with you, of course, with other academics that can be interested in continuing this discourse, linking mega events, urban transformation, and impacts on citizenship. Then our aim is to share an understanding of mega events as a sort of method, as a sort of methodology that is set by usually public and private, public-private partnerships in order to, let's say, transform and create different conditions in the urban realm. In the urban realms is better to say. So with that, I apologize for my delay, and I thank you everyone, and every question or comment is more than welcome.
Thank you, Filippo, for this presentation. If you have any question in the public, do not hesitate to hands up your hand. For myself, I have a question from in terms of law. So you speak about the platform and the data we collected during the games. There is any point made in the adding to the host contract city, the city contract between the IOC, the city that hosts the game, and the national state about this collection of data. Is that a point today, or it's totally new and the IOC didn't have an action on this point? And because we can imagine that the IOC want to have a city host contract to control how the partnership is made in the space of the games, we can imagine that these partnerships can be also control of the platform and data collection in the area of the game. Do you know that? Do you know if the IOC is interested by this point, or do you know if this is the same law that is applied to this platform, or if the same question we have in everyday life in Occident to know who have the right to use or not the data?
No, on this point, I answer. Then you, Naomi, if you want to add something. No, we have not specific information about specific, I mean, specific conditions or contractualization clauses that oblige or specifically restrict the use of data or the ownership of specific data. But we think that since contracts that EOC try to, I mean, is usually proposing and concluding with the urban areas in which they are involved. Usually, of course, they propose the implementation and the use of specific technologies and technological devices that they are, let's say, welcoming or happy to push.
Okay, and do you know why there is yes
with specific
please.
Also with sometimes with specific companies, of course.
Yes, because some of the company partner of the games, I think like Visa or Atos or Panasonic are some companies who use a lot of data and manage a lot of data. So I wanted to know if they have a special agreement, but as you say, okay, it's not the key point. Is there any question in the room? No. So I think we are perfectly in time. Thank you, Filippo, and thank you, Naomi, for the presentation. And we will join the call to have the creation of a community of researchers who work on this question, urban influence, the games, and the citizenship. Now I will let the floor to John Lauermann. Thank you to be here. I don't know if you have the possibility to share your slides now. Yes, it works perfect. And thank you. So now we will pass from Singapore with Naomi to New York with John, and it's 8 in the morning. Thank you to be here so early. Have a good day, Naomi and Filippo, and thank you, John, to have the floor now.
Thank you, Alexandre.
All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction and the great talk we just heard. As Alexandre mentions, it's a little early here, so I apologize in advance if my coffee is not working yet. But I'll share my screen, and I'll state from the outset that if you have questions while I'm speaking, or if there are technical issues while I'm speaking, please feel free to just speak. Just say something. I won't be able to see the chat window while I'm
I just wanted to say, John, this morning we have problem with some trolls. So people try to use the meeting for other reasons. So perhaps you will not have questions during your intervention because I will block the chat.
You'll mute people. Okay.
I prefer to say to you, we don't have problem now from now, but I hope it will not restart like this morning. We had problems with trollers.
All right. Well, then please just let me know if anything comes up in the chat window.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so in this talk, I want to discuss a working paper about the relationship between mega events and gentrification. And the motivation for that is that those two topics are increasingly discussed together in popular media and in activism, in particular among anti-Olympic activists. But there's relatively little academic research on the subject to date, at least in the North American context. And so the paper is trying to kind of establish an empirical baseline and a conceptual framework for future research on this question. Let's see. And so broadly, what I'll do is talk for I think about 40 minutes. I don't remember exactly what Alexandre asked me to speak for, but
yes, you have time. You have you have largely 45 minutes because we have a long schedule now. So you have more than 1 hour for you.
Well, I'm not sure if anyone wants to listen to me for that long, so I'll try to keep it keep it on the shorter end. But 40-45 minutes. Overall, what I want to do is explore the question of if mega event planning has a relationship to gentrification, and if it does, what that relationship looks like. So to do that, I'll show some recent work in which I've used GIS, Geographic Information Science, to map and analyze gentrification patterns in American cities that hosted the Olympics or also that bid on the Olympics. So I'll start by giving you just a brief overview of the core argument. I'll then discuss my conceptual framework, which is based in both gentrification theory and mega event planning scholarship. I'll then work you through the spatial analysis, looking at a series of case studies in American cities. And I'll conclude by connecting these empirical findings back to the theoretical themes of this session, right, on spatial fixes and the role of mega events in facilitating spatial fixes and the limits to that spatial strategy. All right, so there is, as I mentioned, a broad sense that mega events exacerbate gentrification or contribute to gentrification in some way. This is a recurring theme in media coverage. It's also a very common talking point among anti-Olympic activists. However, there's relatively little academic discussion of the topic to date. There is some great recent work on displacement effects in London for the 2012 Olympics and Rio for the 2016 Olympics. But most of those studies focus on very direct displacements, right? Actual demolitions of neighborhoods to make room for Olympic venues. There's relatively little work, though, on the more indirect kinds of displacement effects that we see with gentrification. And so this paper kind of starts from the idea that while these individual stories of displacement are terrible, the individual stories don't necessarily prove a broader pattern, right? And the paper wants to explore whether a broad pattern exists, right? And to quantify what this pattern might look like. So I have two research questions today. The first is, when we look at the spatial strategies of mega event planning, what kinds of neighborhoods are targeted for the location of Olympic venues or Olympic investment. And by kinds of neighborhood, I'm referring to the class profile. Are we talking about neighborhoods that are more working class and therefore vulnerable to gentrification, or perhaps more middle class and therefore less vulnerable? What kinds of neighborhoods in terms of their class profile and their gentrification profile? And then the second question asks, within those targeted neighborhoods, did we then observe demographic changes consistent with displacement? Did those neighborhoods actually change demographically after the Olympics occurred or after an Olympic bid occurred? And if so, did that change? Did it change more than the surrounding city? Right. So is there a correlation with kind of higher rates of displacement? Now, the answer to those questions, in brief, and I'll give you the more detailed version later, but the top line findings are that yes, mega event venues were on average located in areas with higher rates of gentrification than their surrounding cities. And these areas furthermore had very distinctive demographics. For the most part, they had larger populations of color than the surrounding cities. And also higher rates of decline among those populations of color, which in the US is very, it's a very consistent sort of displacement pattern we see with gentrification. So overall, what I found is that there's a very clear spatial correlation between mega event planning and gentrification. However, it's important to state from the outset that, you know, correlation is not causation, right? Further research would be required to show that mega events are actually causing the gentrification. What I suspect is happening is that mega event planning is actually kind of following gentrification. So mega event planners are choosing neighborhoods that are already gentrifying, and therefore kind of adding additional investment into a neighborhood that is already in a state of transition, but not necessarily initiating the gentrification to begin with. In either case, what became very clear from the data is that this relationship between mega event planning and gentrification has evolved over time. There is a very long history in the US of mega event planning targeting vulnerable neighborhoods. In LA 84, for instance, I'll show you how Olympic venues are overwhelmingly concentrated in or were overwhelmingly concentrated in majority minority neighborhoods. But historically, those vulnerable neighborhoods didn't necessarily gentrify after the Olympics occurred. That pattern has changed, however, in more recent decades. And today there's a very direct, kind of clear relationship between mega event planning and actively gentrifying neighborhoods. So to tie this back to the themes of the session, I think this represents a particular kind of mega event spatial fix, in which mega event planners are clustering their investment into already gentrifying neighborhoods. The idea is a neighborhood is already experiencing some degree of gentrification, and mega event investment adds to that ongoing process, and of course, has the potential to exacerbate the negative effects. Now, historically, the rationale for that kind of spatial strategy has been the idea that mega events can act as a catalyst for urban growth. They can be used as a way to pursue urban regeneration. And historically, that may very well have been a good policy. But today, in the American context, American cities just face a different set of challenges, right? It's no longer a country of, you know, post-industrial cities that are struggling for economic growth, right? American cities are economically dynamic places. They're even economically overheated places. And so to use an urban regeneration strategy from a period of deindustrialization in the 1980s in the present day is I think, it's a mistake, right? The challenges facing American cities today are about having too much growth, right? The challenge is not how to generate more growth, but how to manage the growth we already have and the problems associated with too much growth, like the housing crisis. All right. So to explain my analysis, I want to start with a discussion of how I'm conceptualizing gentrification and how I measure its relationship to mega events. So I'll give you a little bit of theory. I'll talk about my methodology for actually measuring gentrification, and then we'll kind of go into the case studies. So broadly, urbanists think of gentrification as a process of class upgrading, right? Specifically, it's about a neighborhood transitioning from a predominantly working class place to a predominantly middle class place, right? So it's about working to middle class transitions. As explained in this quote from Ruth Glass, who wrote the original definition of gentrification, commenting on the process in London in the 1960s. And it's important to understand for our purposes that at least initially, this process of class upgrading has a very specific kind of footprint in the landscape. Initially, it's primarily about renovation, right? As middle-class home buyers move into structures that used to be used as working-class housing, and they renovate the housing and flip it for owner occupancy. But as a neighborhood continues to gentrify, and as gentrification intensifies over time, we may start to see more fundamental landscape changes as things are demolished and new structures are put up. That landscape transition, right? Those landscape characteristics are connected to the particular kind of spatial fix that gentrification involves. And I think we can conceptualize that spatial fix by returning to Neil Smith's classic concept of the gentrification frontier, defined in this quote from his book on the topic. Now, for Smith, the gentrification frontier is the zone where that working to middle class transition is happening. And what is driving that social process, that migration process, is an underlying political economy of investment, right? In the gentrification frontier, what is going on for Smith is a transition from what he calls disinvestment to what he calls reinvestment. Now, disinvestment means kind of urban blight, right? So a lack of investment as capital is pulled out of the neighborhood, whereas reinvestment is about middle-class capital sort of returning to the neighborhood, right? Reinvesting in the landscape through renovation, and eventually through demolition and new construction too. Now, mega events, I think, contribute to a different kind of investment pattern in the gentrification frontier. What I call over investment. Right? And what I mean by that is that mega events are typically not, they don't typically involve renovation of the existing landscape. More often they involve demolition and new construction. And the construction that results is often a mega project, right? It's about mega project development. And the mega project involves enormous amounts of capital being fixed into a relatively small area of land. And so it's a much more spatially intensive sort of investment process, a much more spatially intensive spatial fix. So how do you actually measure it? Right. Well, it's important to understand that gentrification is not a binary condition, right? It's very hard to say that a neighborhood is fully gentrified or fully not gentrified, right? Instead, most urban researchers think about gentrification as a continuum of processes, right? Where we have more or less intensity of class upgrading. And the intensity of those processes reflect those underlying patterns of disinvestment, reinvestment, and overinvestment. Essentially, you get more intensive class transitions, more intensive gentrification as you move from disinvestment through reinvestment to overinvestment. And so the intensity of those processes will vary based on essentially the underlying spatial fix, right? Which is what I'm going to try to quantify in the paper. And I think mega events, what they do is basically intensify the effects along that continuum. And I'll talk about this map on my next slide because it's the index I want to talk about. So to measure that continuum, to model that continuum, I constructed a composite gentrification index. And this is not unique to me. This basic index structure is used by many urban researchers in the US context. But the basic idea here is we take three variables. We look at the change in income, the change in rates of higher education, and the change in housing tenure structure. Specifically, we look at how many people in a neighborhood have lived there for less than 10 years. And we combine those together to create a composite index that ranges from -3 to +3, where higher values indicate higher degrees of gentrification. I won't bore you with the technical details here, but basically what we're doing is we're taking two markers of class, right, income and higher rates of education, and we're combining them with a measurement of residential mobility, right, the percentage of residents who have lived in a neighborhood for less than 10 years. We're combining them together to kind of evaluate the intensity of a gentrification process locally. And the key idea here is simply what I'm doing within this research is I'm comparing local numbers to metropolitan averages. So if you look at this map on I guess on your right, you'll notice that there are a number of polygons in the map, right, with gray lines around the polygons. These are census tracts. A census tract is a unit of aggregation used by the US Census. The technical definition is an area that contains about 7,000 people. And we won't get into the reasons for why, but what I'm doing is for each census tract, I'm looking at the local values of these three variables. How did the income change? How did the rates of education change? How did the rates of residential mobility change? And I'm comparing the local values to the overall average of the metropolitan region. What that allows us to do is ultimately identify areas that are experiencing more or less gentrification. So the map here is showing you something called a hotspot analysis, which is a statistical technique for identifying areas that are similar to each other. So the red areas are areas that are similar to each other and that they're all gentrifying according to that gentrification index. The blue areas are similar to each other in the sense that they're not gentrifying. And the white areas are areas that don't have any strong gentrification pattern one way or another. And as you can see, looking at the black dots are the venues planned for the Los Angeles 2028 Olympics. As you can see, there are a lot of venues in the red gentrification zone on the northern part of this map. All right, so what I did in the study is I applied this index analysis to 4 cities to answer my first research question, what kinds of neighborhoods are targeted. I just mapped out where venues were actually planned for each of these Olympic events. And then I compared it to the gentrification index. To answer my second research question, how did these neighborhoods change? I pulled additional census data on the racial and ethnic composition of each census tract and looked at change over time within the affected census tracts. So my sample has 4 cities. 2 of them hosted the Olympics. Atlanta hosted the 1996 Olympics. Los Angeles hosted the 1984 Olympics. And it merits an additional case study because it will host the 2028 Olympics. I then also included data from Chicago and New York because both cities bid on the Olympics, but they failed. So their bids were failed, unsuccessful. I include those unsuccessful bids though for 2 reasons. The first is that the goal of my study is to understand targeting. right? So I'm trying to understand how mega event planners choose the neighborhoods that they choose when locating venues. And so, of course, that targeting process happened even though during the bidding, even though the bid ultimately failed. And secondly, many cities often implement parts of their Olympic plan, even if the bid is unsuccessful. And so there are potential legacy effects here that we could still measure. In New York, for instance, the bid for the Olympics failed, but the city went on to develop many components of the project anyways. The proposed Olympic Park became the Hudson Yards. The proposed basketball arena became the Barclays Arena. There were several sports facilities in Queens that were developed anyways, like an aquatic center and a baseball stadium. So there are legacy effects, even though the bid failed. The other key thing I want to draw your attention to in these case studies is that they all have a very similar kind of spatial planning concept, in the sense that they're all relying one way or another on clustering, right? The idea is they're clustering Olympic venues and Olympic investment into a relatively small number of places. And that is very consistent with international best practices for mega event planning. It's also the practice that I want to contest today in the talk, because I think it contributes to gentrification. All right. So with this methodology in mind, let's take the cases one by one, and for each, I'll show you the results of a GIS analysis that answers the two research questions for each city. What kinds of neighborhoods were targeted, and how did they change demographically during the time period, during the relevant time period? In brief, and reading across all the case studies, I found a surprisingly strong correlation between mega event planning and gentrification. If we think about the first research question, what neighborhoods are targeted? Well, historically, mega event planning was strongly associated with low-income and majority-minority neighborhoods. But those neighborhoods did not necessarily gentrify over time. More recently, however, the targeting has grown to have a more clear relationship to gentrification in the bids for more recent games, and in LA 2028's site plan. There is a much stronger spatial correlation between the location of Olympic venues and the location of gentrifying neighborhoods. Now, in brief, on the second question, did those targeted neighborhoods change demographically, and did they change faster than the surrounding metro? The short answer is yes. Yes, they changed. Yes, there was displacement. And the racial transition patterns I observed are broadly consistent with gentrification within the US context. So we see increases in the local white population and declines in certain communities of color, in particular declines in Black and Hispanic populations. And again, this relationship has grown stronger over time, right? With each iteration of a mega event plan, it grows stronger over recent history. And I suspect it's likely to be a very major political issue as we move towards Los Angeles 2028. So it's something to consider for LA 2028 planners. All right, so let's take these case studies one by one, and I'll move quickly. For each case study, I'm going to show you 2 data points. The map is a map of that gentrification index. And the way to interpret it is that the red areas are experiencing gentrification, the blue areas are not, and the black dots are the venues used for that particular iteration of the games, or at least planned for that particular iteration of games in the case of failed events. And then the tables I'm going to show you are summarizing the demographics of 2 types of places. The first column summarizes the demographics of census tracts located near venues within a 1 kilometer buffer zone. And the second column summarizes the rest of the city, the rest of the metropolitan area. Right? So we're comparing areas near Olympic venues versus the rest of the city. And for each iteration, I'm going to look at what is the population before the games, right? In the census that occurred most recently before the games. And then how did that population change over the 10-year window during which the games or the bid occurred, depending on whether it's a successful or failed bid. So we're looking at initial population and then 10-year change. Now, Los Angeles 1984 exemplifies the historical pattern, right, where socially vulnerable neighborhoods are being targeted, but they're not necessarily gentrifying. And so we see that here. If you look, take for instance, the neighborhoods near the venues are majority minority, right? They're narrowly majority minority, about 51%, but still majority minority. And that is very unusual as a demographic signature for Southern California in the 1980s. But those neighborhoods then did experience some racial transitions as the games played out. In particular, they lost white population, which is again consistent with the historical time period in American cities. In the 1980s, we had some gentrification emerging, but for the most part, it was not a widespread phenomenon, right? But in the 1980s in the US, the white middle class and upper class lived predominantly in the suburbs, and would only later start to return to the inner city in large numbers. All right, so moving forward to Atlanta, 1996, same basic idea here. The map shows the gentrification index, the table shows demographic change. Atlanta exhibits a similar pattern to LA 84, though we start to see inklings of gentrification in the Atlanta data. Tracks near Olympic venues had a few significant gentrification characteristics. In particular, they had a significant increase in people who had lived in the neighborhood for less than 10 years. So they started to see higher rates of residential mobility, which is one indicator of gentrification, though it is not of itself enough to prove gentrification. Demographically, they had a majority Black population overall. There was some racial transitions, though the numbers are a little tricky to interpret because basically what is happening in these tracks is that they're gaining minority populations, but at a slower rate than the metropolitan average. So it's a unique demographic signature that is specific to the demography of the Atlanta metro, but is I suppose broadly consistent with gentrification. All right, moving on to New York. New York bid for the 2012 Olympics. So the bid was finalized in 2005. So we're looking at the time period of 2000 to 2010 to kind of understand that planning period. In New York, the relationship to gentrification becomes very clear. There's a very clear and statistically strong relationship between the location of venues planned for the New York Olympic bid and gentrification. Those areas near the planned venues, furthermore, experienced very significant racial displacement patterns. In particular, they lost Black population and they gained white population at disproportionately high rates, which is the single most clear indicator of gentrification in the American urban context. So very, very strong signal in New York. And a similarly strong signal in the plans for the Chicago 2016 bid, which again was a failed bid, but nonetheless is important for understanding the relationship between mega event planning and gentrification. Here in Chicago, areas near Olympic venues had some significant gentrification characteristics, though not all characteristics were statistically significant. And they experienced kind of mixed racial transitions. Though again, an increase in white population and a decrease in Black population, which is kind of the key demographic indicator we would look for in the American context. All of this is to say that the circumstances facing Los Angeles in 2028 are very different than those occurring in 1984. Tracks, what I'm showing you here is the map of proposed venues for LA 2028 and their relationship to gentrification patterns. Unlike in 1984, today, there is a very strong statistical relationship between the map of gentrification patterns and the map of Olympic venues. They're very strongly related today. And thus far, the areas near those Olympic venues have experienced demographic transitions consistent with gentrification. Though, of course, it is important to say that it's too soon to tell, right? We still have several years to go before the Olympics, and lots will happen in the urban landscape between now and then. So indicators thus far suggest there is a relationship to gentrification. I think it is very likely that anti-Olympic activists will highlight this process and this relationship in the way that they protest the games. And we'll just have to keep an eye on it and see what happens. But anyways, enough with, let's, in the last 10 minutes or so, I'll loop back to kind of the theoretical themes of this session, thinking about the limits of the mega event spatial fix and what these data on gentrification tell us about mega events spatial fixing. What I'm going to argue ultimately is that under contemporary urban conditions in the US, historical mega event planning models need to be rethought, right? So the historical models focus on the role of mega events as catalyst for urban growth. And I don't think that's an appropriate model for the urban problems of today. It may have been an appropriate model for the urban problems of the 1980s and 1990s, but today the core problem facing many American cities is that of too much growth, right? There's too much growth, there's too much economic development, and as a result, we have problems like a housing crisis and a displacement crisis. And so, using a mega event to add more capital and more investment and more growth is not necessarily the right policy strategy for contemporary cities. The problem lies, I think, in this foundational concept in mega event planning of the catalyst, right? There's a broad recognition in the world of mega event planning that mega events can act as a catalyst for urban growth. And this quote showing on the right is from a paper that I think kind of starts a lot of that conversation in the academic literature published back in the 1990s. But the catalyst idea is that a mega event creates incentives for urban actors to move, right? To overcome institutional inertia and to deliver their projects. Mega events have very hard deadlines for delivery. They have accelerated delivery time schedules, right? Everything has to happen within a few years. And there's immense global media scrutiny. And so altogether that creates incentives for urban stakeholders to kind of build institutional momentum, to speed up things that may have previously been stalled or languishing. Many times what happens in practice is that the mega event introduces a political state of exception into the city. State of exception in the sense that the normal urban planning protocols, which would slow a project down, are abbreviated or passed over. And so mega event planners are able to use the catalyst narrative as a way to kind of breeze past environmental impact reviews and cultural heritage reviews and abbreviate the public participation process and sort of, develop urban projects outside the normal scope of how urban projects are supposed to be developed according to the law. And this catalyst argument is based in a very particular kind of spatial fix, one that's rooted in what the literature calls neoliberal urban governance, or sometimes entrepreneurial urban governance. Here is I think expressed nicely in a quote from David Harvey. He has a pretty famous paper from 1989 on the entrepreneurial city. And he argues that in the context of deindustrialized American and European cities, cities are adopting what was at the time a new kind of spatial fix, what he called a political economy of place rather than of territory. And the basic idea here is that post-industrial cities did not have enough money to spread investment across their entire territories. And so they took the capital that they did have and concentrated them into very particular kinds of projects, right? Specific, discrete spatial projects, like a new park or a new shopping mall or an Olympic facility, right? An Olympic investment. And the assumption here is that highly concentrated investment in a particular place would generate growth effects that would effectively diffuse outward into the surrounding landscape. The idea here behind this model is that we have kind of a trickle out growth model, right? So growth happens in one very targeted investment site, one spatial fix, and then it trickles out or it diffuses outward in the surrounding neighborhood. And whether or not that actually happened is a hotly contested debate within the literature, but that is kind of the assumption underlying the catalyst in mega event planning, right? Targeted investment in a small handful of places, like an Olympic park or an Olympic village, will generate growth that kind of trickles out and diffuses outward into the surrounding city. And we see that very much in the spatial planning concepts of the various case studies I showed you. All of them in one way or another target their investment into a single place or maybe a small cluster of places. And if you read through their bidding documents and their planning documents, they're very much talking about the way that this small targeted investment, geographically small targeted investment will kind of diffuse outward into broad-based growth. Now, that model may have been appropriate for deindustrializing cities in a state of decline, as American cities were in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. But as I've said, conditions have shifted dramatically since then. Today, American cities are booming, and the problem is not a lack of growth, but rather of too much growth, of too much capital, of too much affluence being concentrated into a small, relatively small area of land. And I think if we use a mega event to continue fixing additional capital into that kind of place, what we get is not urban regeneration, but what we get instead is what Roland Atkinson recently called alpha territory. He has a new book on the alpha city, which looks at extreme inequality and the way that sort of elite real estate investment intensifies extreme inequality. And the idea here is simply that some neighborhoods, some super gentrified neighborhoods, they've experienced so much growth, they have so much affluence, they have so much capital, that they effectively act as almost like social citadels, where they have plenty of wealth, and they effectively displace anyone without wealth, right? They displace the lower classes, the working classes, but also increasingly, they displace the middle classes as well, right? They create kind of ultra elite spaces. And so, if we think back to kind of core gentrification theory, I think what we risk doing by concentrating development into a small handful of clustered neighborhoods is we risk creating new kinds of alpha territories, right? American cities today, by and large, do not need a mega event catalyst. And so if you add a mega event catalyst, despite the fact that it's not necessary, what you will get is more gentrification, intensified gentrification. You will get gentrified neighborhoods that become even more gentrified over time. And that's a logical extension of the data we saw, right? As mega event planners increasingly choose to locate venues in already gentrifying neighborhoods, the result will most likely be that additional investment, that overinvestment into a neighborhood will intensify gentrification effects. All right. So very quickly to wrap up, I think this has really major implications for mega event planning. I want to suggest that the time has come for our field to kind of rethink the fundamental assumptions of what a good spatial strategy is when planning a mega event. And this has implications for mega event planning and also for host cities that are considering a mega event. Right. Now it's clear that under these current conditions of intense urban growth and the housing crisis, fundamental principles of mega event planning need to be rethought. In particular, some of the best practices, the spatial planning best practices associated with mega event planning, they just don't work under conditions of gentrification. They are counterintuitive to best practices for minimizing gentrification. For instance, regeneration models like the Barcelona model may actually do more harm than good when applied to a city that doesn't need urban regeneration. Likewise, there are certain kinds of sustainability practices encouraged by the IOC, in particular, kind of clustering development into one location to minimize trips and travel time. And that makes perfect sense from the standpoint of sustainability, but it could actually, dramatically increase gentrification and displacement in the neighborhoods that are being targeted for that highly concentrated investment. What we need, I think, is instead to spatially distribute the spatial plan for the mega events. We need to spread mega events out, spreading the games more uniformly across the metropolitan region, or maybe even spreading venues across multiple cities in the same country. But we need to reduce the local urban impacts of mega events by spreading them out. And then I think from the perspective of host cities, there needs to be some fundamental rethinking about the role of mega events in urban planning. At minimum, organizing committees need to stop using mega events as a state of exception, right? They need to stop using catalyst narratives or leveraging narratives or legacy narratives to bypass existing urban planning law, and they need to just follow the rules, right? There are certain rules that effectively slow down urban development, but slowing urban development down is the point, right? The point of participatory urban planning rules or about environmental impact requirements is to slow it down and to step back and ask whether the city actually needs a particular project. And I think there's no reason why mega event planners shouldn't be expected to follow the same rules as any other sort of planners. And more broadly, I think, and this is my very last point, we need to make housing into an explicit legacy category. And perhaps housing is the most important legacy category for many North American and European cities, right? The housing crisis is the single most important issue for many cities today. And so it stands to reason that any mega event plan today should include a very explicit housing legacy plan, a plan with specific measurable goals for a socially inclusive housing legacy and for an affordable housing legacy. All right, with that, I will stop. Thank everyone for their time and ask if there are any questions. I'll also stop sharing the screen at this time.
Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for this exciting presentation and purpose. If there is anybody who wants to ask a question, do not hesitate to hand up your hand and to have the mic. I will perhaps, there is a question. So Gustavo Lopez dos Santos, you have the mic. I give you the mic now.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you? I don't know why I can turn my camera on. Thank you very much for this presentation. I actually have lots of questions as I'm writing about the subject for my thesis. But I'll try to sum it up to 3 questions.
Sure.
The first is you have sort of classified gentrification with race or ethnics. Did you also try to use incomes to see these relations? My second question is
Gustavo, you can use your camera now. It was blocked because we have problems this morning, but now you have your camera. Perfect, it's working.
So my second question would be, given that, especially for the case of Los Angeles, the venues for both editions, they were existing. Can we assume that they were chosen for gentrification purpose? What I'm saying is that, does LA has that many venues that organizers could choose others? And my third question is just to know an opinion of yours, which is, given that mega events, they have this boosted impact on housing markets and, well, everything, whatever. Do you think that gentrification should, or do you see a potential for using gentrification instead of trying to block it, of using it to address other issues, namely affordable housing, but not directly related with the event? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Gustavo, thank you for those questions. And I hope sometime we can chat about your research. I guess this goes for anyone in the session. I'm very eager to collaborate on this topic. So if it's of interest, please shoot me an email. On the first question, incomes versus race. So gentrification at its core is about class. And so my core gentrification index measures class change, right? Changes in class. But then, what we're actually interested in is how the class transition shapes, social geographies. So conceptually, I think of the class transition as the driver, and then the racial transitions as the outcomes. So as class transitions are occurring, certain racial and ethnic groups are being impacted in different ways, right? So that's the relationship. On the question of, the existing venues in LA. So one of the core kind of ideas in the LA 2028 bid proposal was that they would use existing venues and thereby kind of minimize the impacts of the game. And to some extent that is true, though not all the venues are pre-existing. Like there is new investment. But I think those existing venues that were chosen twice for 1984 and again 2028, they present a fascinating case study because they show kind of how the American city is changing under the, over time, right? So the neighborhood conditions surrounding those venues has evolved remarkably since 1984. And that's why I'm very careful to avoid saying that, mega event planning is causing gentrification, because I don't think it's a directionality in causes. I think what's actually going on is American cities are gentrifying simultaneously with mega planning, new kinds of spatial interactions are emerging, right? So, which of course a mega event planner would need to account for, even if they aren't, responsible for the gentrification that is happening outside of their venue. And then the last question about, can we leverage gentrification? Yeah, that's a question we could spend all day talking about. I think it is important to understand that gentrification needs to be interpreted intersectionally, right? We need to interpret this through different intersections of race, class, age, gender. And what emerges is that there's actually a very complex topography of winners and losers, right? So even within groups that are being displaced, for instance, Black populations that are being displaced, there are class differentials within the Black population. And so, upper class Black homeowners may benefit from these processes, whereas, working class Black renters may not. So it's important to differentiate that, though, of course, every additional layer of complexity means more slides and more time talking.
Thank you for this answer. Now I will give the floor to Marie de la Place.
Oh, and you are muted.
I think you need your mic, Marie. Why it didn't work, I will try to understand. Yes, I give you now the mic.
Okay, thanks for your presentation. I have just a comment concerning gentrification, because as you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you use some old papers concerning gentrification. And gentrification, it was developed in terms of class. And I think that today it is more difficult to identify class, because I think that the society is more diverse than 40 years ago. So how can we identify today gentrification based on income, of course, perhaps income, but I think that there is also other variables which are very important, such as the status, I don't know if it is a term, the status of employed or unemployed, yes. Short-term employed or long-term employed, and so on.
Yeah, I agree completely. So the gentrification index I use is actually based on more recent research, like we published within the last 5 years or so. I think in general, we need to approach this question from a geographically specific perspective, right? Of course, class in the United States is very different than class in any other country, and so we need kind of geographically specific definitions. In a more specific sense, in the US, class is typically measured in the recent quantitative literature using a couple key categories. Income, of course. Education is a particularly important variable within the US, specifically whether you have a bachelor's degree or higher level of education. And I think that is perhaps more pronounced in the US context than elsewhere in the world. But college education is a very strong marker of class. And then some gentrification researchers will also use variables like occupation. Within the census, you can measure, there are different occupational categories one can measure. And so if you dig deep enough, you can isolate, white collar occupations or creative class occupations. Though I have found in my own work that the statistical signature is just too weak. And I think it's more because of the way that the census data are structured than because of the phenomenon itself. But yeah, occupation is another. And then housing ownership and the value of one's house is very important in the US context. For many American households, your home is your single largest financial asset. And so if you own a home and your home value is quite high, that is potentially a marker of class as well. And so there are some studies that use home ownership and the value of home ownership as a marker. I didn't use it in this one because some of the cities included in the sample have low home ownership rates in general. Like in New York, only 30% of people actually are homeowners. So it's not a overly reliable variable, but that's another possibility. But yeah, I suppose that's a long-winded way of saying we need to think about class as a geographically specific phenomenon with, kind of local characteristics.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I have a question from my part. So you finally, what you say, we can say that gentrification is part of the heritage of the game. It is a large part of the heritage of the game, and because you finally you think that gentrification is not necessarily a positive thing. But how do you know, how do we know in general, our researchers, that this gentrification is not a will of the elected representative? How do you know that? And in this case, I have, so the first question is, yes, can we imagine that some cities want the gentrification of heritage, and it is a will or not from the elected representatives? That is good question. And the second one is, if we have this situation, and in general we can say that researchers imagine gentrification in a negative way, how do we use the interviews as a methodological way? So because in interviews, I imagine no politicians will say, we want to have gentrification and to eradicate the poverty by displace them outside. So how you use interviews in this case, and what can we learn about the interviews in a methodological way, and what can we replace, by what can we replace the interviews in the methodology for this kind of study? Yeah. Sorry for this question, perhaps a little bit long, but.
No, and I'll take the questions one by one, right? So to the first question, gentrification is absolutely a desired outcome for some politicians and some elected leaders, right? I mean, they're very, historically, they're very open about this goal. When I have done sort of archival research looking for quotes from different elected officials at the time, they're very open about the idea that the mega events can be used to encourage gentrification. They don't necessarily use that word, gentrification, but they use related concepts like urban regeneration or urban renewal or growth or neighborhood improvement, right? There are very clear motivations. In more recent years, elected leaders have become more cautious in the way that they describe this goal. I don't think any urban elected official today would be bold enough to say they want gentrification, right? It's become sort of the boogeyman of American urban politics. But yeah, at least historically, that is clearly a desired outcome. And I think, politically, you just have to decide which side you are on, right? Whether you view this as a desirable process or an undesirable process. To your second question, how to integrate qualitative data? I think there are maybe two ways. One is to interview decision makers, whether they are planners or elected officials or business leaders, or to interview them to understand their spatial strategy, right? Why the neighborhoods that they're choosing, right? Why is it that they are prioritizing one neighborhood over another? And that can tell us much about kind of how they're conceptualizing the neighborhoods that are being, right? And why those neighborhoods are desirable, why those neighborhoods are viewed as a safe place to invest, and so on. The other way we could use qualitative research is, of course, to ask people who are affected, people who are displaced. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there is some great research on direct displacements, right? People in London and in Rio who were directly displaced to make room for Olympic venues. But the challenge with gentrification is that the displacement is typically not, right? You are not typically, bulldozed out of your home, and instead you're sort of gradually displaced out of the neighborhood as the rent increases a little bit. So you move to a new apartment, and then the rent increases again, so you move to another apartment, and so on. And I think qualitative research is a very effective tool to kind of understand that longer term, more indirect process of displacement, right? Why is it that certain people ultimately left the neighborhood, and what were the chain of events that led to their displacement? Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any question in the room? If not, I have some questions. So when you spoke about David Harvey, you say that he spoke about spatial fix and the notion of investment in a place in regard to the notion of territory. So how do you think that finally David Harvey defined the place in opposition to territories in terms of social aspect? I want to know, for example, when we speak about place, finally, we didn't speak about inhabitants. We didn't speak about the population who are around. We only speak about the place as a kind of totem, we can say in French, and I think you understand. And how do you include the population in the notion of place from David Harvey point of view and spatial fix point of view?
Yeah, so that literature that Harvey is a part of, it's taking place at a moment in which researchers are debating a transition away from urban collective consumption, right? So the idea is that historically, before neoliberalism, cities focused on, investing in collective consumption, right? So they focused on kind of territorially diffuse projects, like investing in an infrastructure network, like a transit network across the entire city. And what he's describing is a rethinking of spatial strategy towards spatially discrete projects as opposed to collective consumption. And I think originally in that literature, they're just describing the phenomenon. I don't think there's a whole lot of thought around who are the populations that are receiving this new kind of investment. In retrospect, looking back, in many cases, that kind of new spatial targeting benefited elite neighborhoods, right? In many instances, what is happening in practice is that the city is pulling investment out of disadvantaged neighborhoods and redirecting it towards already affluent neighborhoods, right? So already affluent neighborhoods get more upgrades, and already disadvantaged neighborhoods receive austerity. Though I think that is probably changing under conditions of gentrification, but yeah, that's sort of the context in the 1980s. And I think it's important to note that we have entered a moment of transition in urban policy where the theories developed in the 1980s are reaching the end of their useful life because conditions on the ground have evolved so thoroughly.
And in the continuation of this question, do you think that the transformation of the bidding system in Tokyo, of the IOC bidding system, with the abandon of the candidature, and finally the IOC go to one city and one this city like Brisbane for the games of 2032, do you think that this changing system will be more in favor of Alpha City? You spoke about the Alpha City, and we see that the last 2 decades we have a reconcentration of the game on Alpha City. And do the IOC in this way changing is abandoning his bidding system, is going to want to focus on few cities and perhaps the Alpha one, and not Athens as we can imagine 20 years ago, but now it will be more the Alpha? Do you think that this situation is possible, and in this case we will continue to have a spatial fix on few cities, and finally the games will become really an instrument and a tool of gentrification in the global stage? So what do you think about the transformation of this bidding system in Tokyo in Tokyo by the IOC?
Yeah, I suppose I need to think about it more, since we're co-writing a paper on questions that might be relevant, or those questions will be relevant to our paper. Yeah, so I think the IOC's transition towards this more informal, invitation-only sort of bidding system, I think the intention is good, right? The intention is to make it less onerous for potential host cities, and to give potential host cities more flexibility as they develop their Olympic plans. And so the intention is good, because more flexibility is exactly what host cities need to reconcile mega event planning with those broader participatory planning practices I mentioned, right? Like, it takes time to integrate public participation into planning a site, and to do environmental impact reviews and the like. So the intention is good. I think in practice, what may happen is that only certain kinds of cities will be invited, or will be considered as serious contenders. In particular, large global cities that already have very well-developed sports infrastructure will be automatically more competitive for these sorts of events. And to the extent that those large global cities also have gentrification problems, I think that we're likely to see more conversation over time about the relationship between the Olympics and gentrification. But again, I don't think we should necessarily say that one is causing the other, but just they overlap in space, and so of course they become a policy problem of relevance.
And before to give to Filippo the talk, I see that Florian says isn't the surfing venue of the 2024 Paris Olympics happening in Tahiti already an example of the broadening of the host city concept?
Yeah, I think so. And there's of course much precedent for this. In many previous games, some sports are organized regionally or even nationally. Sailing would be another example. In the US, football is always a national event, because American cities can't be bothered to build a football stadium. so football is always nationalized in American Olympics. Yeah, there are many examples of kind of broadening the spatial footprint of the games. And I think they probably offer us lessons for best practice as to how to do this if we wanted to make the practice more common. Yeah, I don't know if we have to go all the way to Tahiti to do that, but yeah.
I will give the talk to Filippo Bignami now, and after to Sven.
Yeah.
Filippo, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, John, for the exciting presentation. Just a quick question. You also cited Harvey So you probably also in your consideration of gentrification also include a sort of consideration about urban citizenship definition and conception. So basically my question is quite straight and it is quite fast. Do you think that, so basically urban citizenship is, let's say in a very trivial way, that is a matter of divide those who are included, those who are excluded, those who have access to services, those who have not, those who have privileged to certain areas, and those not. So it's a matter of divide. So do you think that mega events can be seen as a new front in terms of urban citizenship elements or ingredient, let's say, to create an additional and problematic driver in terms of the conception of urban citizenship?
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think about this question. So two ideas. The first is that the planning process is, in my opinion, a platform for exercising those citizenship rights. At least in American cities, and I suppose in European cities too, there are very explicit kinds of events and platforms. Some of them are live events, some of them are digital platforms, but there are like specific avenues where citizens can not only express their opinions, actively participate in the planning. For instance, it's very common to do planning charrettes, which are basically kind of workshops in which citizens can come in and sit down with the map or with the drawing and actually draw to kind of diagram out what the plan should look like. And so that is an avenue that exists for exercising your citizenship right in many cities. I think one of the problems with mega event planning, at least in the way it's been practiced historically, is that those sorts of avenues are abbreviated, right? When we think about the mega event as a catalyst to speed things up, in effect, what you're saying is we don't have time for citizenship, right? We don't have time for these silly, gadflies to come in and, tell us what we can and cannot do. Right? We don't have time. We just have to do it. And so I think anything we can do to slow the process back down, to reintroduce participation into the planning process is a way to enhance citizenship rights. The second thing I'll say is mega events present a unique challenge to the notion of the right to the city, right? If urban citizenship is about a right to the city, mega events complicate both the right and the city. They complicate the right part because, of course, different stakeholders have different degrees of access to urban institutions and urban decision making. The sorts of divides you mentioned in your question. But the mega events also complicate what is a city, because they're not typically occurring in only one jurisdiction, right? They're typically planned across a metropolitan region. And depending on the political geography of that particular region, we might have multiple municipalities involved. And so there's all sorts of complications around, citizen of what jurisdiction and how does that fit into the broader whole of planning.
Thank you, John. Sven, you have the floor.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk. Filippo, I don't know if it's because we are both in Switzerland, but you asked most of what I wanted to ask. So, but I do have a quick little follow-up about it. Just, John, do you have a sense of? First, it's brilliant work and really a lovely way to get this both nuanced and important view on some processes that are, I think, too often shrouded in fuzzy conceptualization. So it's it's really nice to see, very impressive. I'm wondering about the role in which mega event planning is presented somewhat, and I don't mean this in a bad critique at all, but is presented a little bit in this presentation as sort of a homogeneous feature, and how because you know better than most how different Boston was from LA, to say nothing of Atlanta or New York or any of the other processes that happen in the United States. So how can you make sense of the interplay of local development agendas, coming into contact with this sort of global processes of mega event hosting? So the local development agenda may be more or less desirous of gentrifying certain neighborhoods, and so how can we use your model to make sense of, I guess, different starting points in different cities? But man, it's fascinating work. I can't wait to see the paper.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so as we all know, the term mega planning, I think, is more aspirational than real, right? Like, it exists as a concept, but as a informal affair. At a local level, in general, local organizers have very little idea of what it means to plan a mega event before they enter the process. So there's a learning on the ground, and of course there's endless local variations on motivations and outcomes. Though at the same time, at a global level, there are fairly well developed best practices, right? The IOC has its manuals. It's look at the games manual, it's planning manuals. So there are, and of course there are consultants who deal in the stock and trade of distributing best practices for mega planning. So you're right, there is this strange tension in the field in which there is a very clear idea of what best practice should be in a global sense, but then when it touches down into the local context, it's taken in all sorts of directions, with almost endless variations. And so, yeah, what I can say for sure is that in American cities, certain tropes continuously pop up, right? The idea of a catalyst, the idea of clustering, the idea of concentrating investment into very spatially discrete mega projects, right? That is a very consistent idea across what is now almost 40 years of mega event planning. And I'm not sure how much of that is US specific versus international best practice, but since they obviously influence each other, but there are consistencies, qualitative consistencies, right? Obviously, their quantitative dimensions vary, but qualitatively there are consistencies in kind of the overarching strategies behind the plans.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. If there is no other question, I propose we will have a little break because it was a nice speech, but dense speech. Thank you for your presentation. And I propose we have a break and we will restart at 3:30 for the continuation of the day. Thank you, John, and see you in a few minutes. So thank you. I will do my presentation now. Thank you to everybody to be here for this afternoon, and thank you, Greg, to join us so early in the morning. I will have now a presentation about the case of Paris. I will put my slides. So I think the share is good. Yes, this is good. Thank you, everybody, to be here. I am Alexandre Faure, postdoctorant at the Fondation France-Japon of FFJ-EHESS, who organize the conference today. And I will have a presentation that is a little bit different than the previous title. It is a game of scales for Paris 2024, how to study the spatial diffusion of the games in France. So this work is a part of an article we are writing with Professor José Chaboch from the University of Orléans. He is not able to be here today, but I will present a common work we have with José. Yeah, so the idea of this work to question the notion of scales in France is that Paris 2024 try to have a new approach of the national integration of other territories that are not in the core center of Paris, or that are not territories which support one of the venues of Paris 2024, and they try to ask to the different local level authorities and the different municipalities in France to invest in Paris 2024. So that means we spoke a lot from the beginning with different scale, but at this time I will go out a little bit of the Olympic City and look at what happened outside of Paris, outside of the old city. So we can say that for this work, I will start from the suburb and to go to the national event and to show the huge diversity of territories that try to use Paris 2024 for their own goals in local policy. So the different scales of Paris 2024 is evidently the Paris as a city of symbol. I think it's important for foreigner to understand that the French system, the French governance, territorial governance is very complex with many different municipalities and departments. So we have in France more than 35,000 municipalities. That is a very huge number in comparing to the rest of Europe, and I think it's the US too. And in the Paris region, so the regional level is one of the level of the French administration, and in the Paris region, named Île-de-France, we have more than 1,200 municipalities. In Paris is one of these 1,200 municipalities. We have also 8 departmental level and 1 regional level in the Parisian region. The Olympic Games of Paris 2024 is planned to be focused and concentrated on 2 areas. One is the central part of Paris and with the heritage that everybody knows, the Invalides, the Eiffel Tower, évidemment, all these monuments that make the image of Paris in the world. But also the second center will be in the northern suburb of Paris, near to the core center. It's not very far, 5 or 6 kilometers, but this suburb is most famous for its popular constitution with high level of inequalities, but also high level of cosmopolitanism, a very big diversification of the population, and with the impact and the influence of the long-term immigration in this part of Paris. It was also in this part that the industrial district of Paris exists in the past, and now it is, as John mentioned, a place of gentrification with many projects of renovation and requalification of this area in order to implant more residential and tertiary, so office buildings in this part in replacement of the old industries that existed in the past. And so these 2 parts are the central part of the Paris 2024 with the Olympic Village, the stadium, all the big venues and permanent venues. The second part in the regional area of Paris is the western and eastern suburb with some of the long-term venues, very specific, like the velodrome, the kayak and aviron. I don't remember in English, it's terrible, aviron. it's a sport, so the sport, water sport we can have in some basin, in some lake, and this forms the Paris area project, urban project for the games. We have also, after Paris, the sailing in Marseille, as John mentioned too, and as Florian explained, the Tahiti surfing center in 13,000 kilometers from Paris in the Pacific Ocean. And so we can see that even if we talk only about venues, we have some venues of Paris 2024 that are far away from the core city. But the other, if we don't talk only about venues, we can say that for Paris 2024, there is two different public policy tools that propose to collectivities, to local level authorities, to use the game for local goals that are not directly linked to the games. It means that we have, the Paris 2024 created a label for the territories who want to be part of the terre de jeu, land of the games, for Paris 2024. I will explain what is it. And the second public policy tools, it's a center of the preparation of the games, centre de préparation des jeux, that is more common. It's all the local level authorities who want to receive a foreign delegation, a foreign delegation that want to have training in France before the games. So it was for the background. The question we asked with José Chaboch, Professor José Chaboch, is which local authorities are using the games of Paris 2024 and through which public policy instrument, and what is the pattern of diffusion of the local level authorities who want to use this public policy instrument. Okay, it was really a geographical question at the beginning, and the hypothesis we have is that the territories and the local level authorities, the more that invest more in Paris 2024 can be considered as closest to the venues of Paris and Marseille, for example, and we can imagine that a diffusion of the use of the games from the center of the games to the periphery of the games. This first hypothesis, as we will see, is not really what happened when we analyze the data of which local level authorities use the games, and we see that the geography of the sport in France is very important to explain how the games is used by local authorities outside of Paris. The methodology was not very different to what I explained. So we have the identification of the public policy instrument used by local level authorities to appropriate the games. And after we collect the data, and more particularly, we see in March 2021 that approximately 1,500 local authorities has obtained the label Terre de Jeu or became center of preparation of the game. So it means that many local level authorities tried to use the games or to have benefits from the games outside of Paris. And we use this data and we put it in the map via QGIS to analyze this data. So now, before to have the analysis of the data, what is Terre de Jeu? So Terre de Jeu is land of the game in English, is a label. So it is described by Paris 2024 website as the sentence you can read it. So during the bid phase, Paris 2024 announced that Paris Games will be for all the country. With the Terre de Jeu 2024 label, we are making this promise a reality. The unique mechanism in the history of the games will promote the local authorities that are working to develop and include sport from the local to the regional level, and including the various players in the sports movement. Paris 2024 involves all the territories and goes even further by including the structure of the sport movement of the French community abroad at the heart of this approach. So it is very interesting to see in this narrative that the Paris 2024 Olympic Committee tried to use public policy tools to make the games a national matter and not only a local matter. And for that, they are using the question of sport and the local competence that have the municipality, and more particularly the municipality, questioning the sport. So the idea of terre de jeu is for, if you are a local level authorities, you want to have the label, you need to say, we will renovate one of our venues for sport, one of your facilities for sport, and we will promote the sport as a school, for example, or for older people. And Paris 2024 gives a label that permits to the municipalities to make publicity, advertisement in the street with the label Terre de Jeu as a city who support Paris 2024. So this is not directly subsides from Paris 2024 for local level authorities. It's only an incitative tools that give to the local level authorities the possibility to use the symbol of the games to promote their action concerning sports in the local level. So as you understand, it's not really an intervention from the national committee organization, but more the idea that the national level authority concerning the games want to propose to local level authorities to participate to the game, but at their own, with their own money and not the money from Paris 2024. The second public policy instrument is Centre de Préparation des Jeux, so Center for Preparation of the Games. That is all the local level authorities who want to be candidate to host a delegation. So this is correlated to the idea we made in France during the Games of London in 2012. Many municipalities in the north of France proposed to international delegation to use their facilities for training before the Games of London. And the idea was to benefit from the Games of London by receiving this delegation, which will consume some local product like and local service like hotel, like restoration, evidently, like local transport companies. So it is a very indirect income from the games, but for cities that are absolutely not directly linked to the core center of the city who hosts the games. So the northern part of France is close to London because of two ways. You can easily join the England by boat, evidently, but also by train with the channel. So it means that you use the proximity from London to receive benefits from the organization of the games, even if you are not in England. So Paris 2024 describes the center of the games. The preparation center for the games meet precise technical characteristics concerning their sport facilities and their reception service, accommodation, catering, transport, security. Depending on the infrastructure and service offered, the communities will make their choice from the catalog and send their team, according to the sport, to the centers most suited to their needs. From 2021 until Paris 2024, the ambience of the games and the world sporting elite will be invited throughout France on the CPGs to prepare for exceptional Olympic and Paralympic Games. So two different words is interesting in the presentation made by Paris 2024. The first one is the question of the ambience. They want to the narrative of Paris 2024 is to say that if you receive some delegation who will train in countryside before to go to Paris, you will have in a certain way kind of benefits in terms of ambience, atmosphere in the city during the preparation. That means that you need to advertise your population, that you are hosting a delegation from international delegation for the games. And it means also that the Paris 2024 is not the real promoter of this policy, but more the organizer of who can receive or not the delegation. In fact, the Paris 2024 is not the only way for international delegation to have a training in France. If some international delegation want to go in a place that is not a center for preparation of the games, there is no possibility for the Paris 2024 to make an obligation to this delegation to go in one center of the preparation of the game. So it's only an incitation and absolutely not an obligation for the delegation to pass through the system of the center of preparation of the games. So there's two public policy instruments, as you understand. The label as well as the center of preparation of the games is two ways to try to have more benefits of the games for local authorities that are not in the Parisian region, but this is not, it's not a guarantee for these municipalities or local level authorities to have benefits of the games. So now, as I explained, we try to, we put in the maps the different authorities that propose to have the label Terre de Jeu or to be a center of preparation of the games. And we see that it's a national phenomenon. So this map is only for the center of preparation of the games. In blue, you have the intermunicipal level. So in French, municipalities can be gathered in one intermunicipal, so mega municipality, we can say. And the black points are about the municipalities only. We can see that the mega region Paris, the mega region, so this is the regions that regroup all the territories dependent of the economy of Paris center, is not concentrated all the center of preparation of the games, and there is not specially an influence between the distance from Paris and the fact that some municipalities can be a center of preparation of the games. We see two different kind of a center of preparation of the games. So the little point are for municipalities that propose only one or two disciplines, and the biggest point are for municipalities or intermunicipalities that propose more than 20 or for someone 40 different disciplines for the international delegation. We can see in this map that Paris evidently focus part of this center of preparation of the games, but you find also in the north of France there's local level authorities which benefits of London. You have also in the west part of France local municipalities which want to benefit from the games, and that are part of this local network of municipalities who promote the sport in general, and that really visible in this map. And you have also some typical points. The blue one in the middle of France is Vichy, more famous for his the role of the city during the Second World War than for other things in France. But it was interesting to know that during the Second World War, the Vichy government implanted in Vichy many sports facilities. And so Vichy is one of the cities with the most important center for sports. So it's why the municipalities propose to be a center of the games. And you see at the east part some municipalities like Strasbourg and Colmar, two cities next to the border, and they want to propose to European teams to have a delegation here in Alsace. So there is no really a pattern from this map, and finally we can't say that even if you are not at the proximity of Paris, you are not able to use the games of Paris 2024. It also means that a lot of territories and a lot of local level authorities try to use the games, even if they are very far from Paris. And so this means that the games is not only a question of the Parisian suburb, but also a national level question. In more precisely and in terms of number, so 47% of the municipalities with the label Terre de Jeu are also center of preparation of the games. That means that the two different public policy tools are used by half of the municipalities, which are interesting by these public policy tools. 34% of the local level authorities with the label Terre de Jeu are in Parisian region. So it means that 1/3 of them. So it's not a huge concentration, but 40% of the municipalities that are center of preparation of the games are in Parisian region. So it means that the label is more developed outside of the Parisian region than the center of preparation of the games that are concentrated in general around Paris, but more concentrated, I want to say, than the label. If we make now, if we have a zoom on the Parisian region, so at the top you have the center of preparation of the games, and at the bottom you have the Terre de Jeu label. You can see that there is some huge difference between the different parts of the region. You can see that for the label, the point blue, yellow and black point are only a question of time. So the yellow point are the 500 first municipalities with the label, and the black point are the others that join after the beginning of the campaign for the labelization. And we can see that the Paris and the Paris suburb concentrate a lot of the municipalities that have the label, and there is a huge difference between the core center and the second crown of Paris, so the second suburb of Paris that didn't have much municipalities with the label. We can see another pattern is that outside of the mega region, so the red border, you can see that at the west part of the mega region, there is many inter-municipality that are part of the public policy tools of Terre de Jeu. And it means that this is, we have a kind of concentration of the labelization inside the core center of the metropole. After that, we have many municipalities that are not interesting, and we have a new wave of municipalities, including in this public policy, in the third or fourth crown of Paris. So the question of proximity is interesting because if we analyze, and I will finish with this point, I was quicker than I imagined, we can say that the municipalities closest to the Olympic venues in Paris and in the immediate suburbs are almost all with the label. This is the first thing. So our hypothesis was not totally false, and we can say that closer you are from the center of Paris, closer you are from the public policy tools that are put in place by Paris 2024 for the nationalization of the games. But there is a huge gap with all the local level authorities in the second crown and third crown of Paris that are from the rural area and that are not, seem to be not interesting by using the game as a public tool for their benefits. And finally, the other point we tested, but we don't have now a map, and we will continue our work on this question. There is no pattern concerning the poverty or not, or the inequalities of the different municipalities involved in these two public policy tools, and particularly considering that the fact that in the suburb of Paris, the vast majority of the municipalities are part of these two public policy tools, even if they are poor, even if they are rich, there is no difference. And we try to find now the pattern in terms of social inequalities, but we didn't find a pattern that seemed to explain who want to have the label or not. And we will try to understand if the pattern, the most interesting pattern will be more about the public policy in terms of sports and the national network of the sport office in municipalities. So thank you, and if you have any question, do not hesitate to ask me. Yes, Marie, please.
Yes, thanks for this presentation. It's a very interesting one. I think that we must go behind geographical proximity. I think it's more important to work with organizational proximity, with cultural proximity, and especially concerning sport value. I think that it is the most important. I don't know if you know the French school of proximity. It's a school of geographer, but also economists and planner and so on. And we show that geographical proximity doesn't explain anything. And we must work on other kind of proximity, and especially organizational proximity, sometimes institutional proximity. And I think it's very important to work on value, and especially sport value, to understand where there is some land of games in France, and some centre préparation for preparing the games.
Yes, thank you. It's really what we want to have now for the qualitative approach. It's that we want to work on this question by the sport office and sport and health office. That is an important point from the local level authorities in France in terms of competencies. And so we will try to understand if there is a link, for example, between the label and the network of the local level elected politicians. And we think that perhaps there exists a link with the national Olympic and sport office committee, the KNOSOF, and perhaps we will find a good key to understand this geography by this way. So thank you, Marie, for these remarks, and I will look more about what you say. John, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Alexandre, for a great talk and really fascinating new approach to the ways in which mega events are planned and conceptualized in a geographic sense. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about what are the benefits of achieving this label, right? Is there funding attached to it? Is there some sort of broader local development benefit? And also, if you could speak about the ways in which local officials are framing that benefit. Is this something that cities are actively pursuing as a political project, or is it more just something that is a bureaucratic exercise?
So it seemed to be a little bit complex to understand how the Paris 2024 committee, Olympic Committee, give or not the label to the municipalities. They say they have a very long document to explain what are the actions they can do to have the label, but finally they have no indicator to evaluate if the municipalities or local level authorities use in the good way the label. So this is another difficult point we have, that it seems that every municipality's candidate have the label without difficulties. Perhaps Hugo will have a good explanation for that, because I know no, perhaps not, but yes, the label seems to be something very opaque to understand how they give or not. Concerning the benefits, it seems that there is not uniform, homogeneous benefits between the different municipalities that want to have or not the label. Some municipalities want only to use as an advertisement, and we can see when we are in the Parisian region, some municipalities have a big poster in the street to say we are Terre de Jeu, we are Land of the Game. So some of the municipalities use that, but others didn't use absolutely not use the label, or not in the street, it's not visible for citizens. Perhaps it's used in the municipal publication or in the municipal website, and perhaps we need on this way. The next step will certainly be to analyze what kind of different action the municipalities with the label have during the preparation phase. So it can be the next step, another next step. After the analysis of the geography, we will have the analysis of what they do with the label. But perhaps it's too close to Paris 2024 to have this collection of data. And particularly with the COVID, it seems that it will be interesting to have for us a good reflection about the protocol and the methodology, because it can be the same that we imagined before the COVID. Perhaps Hugo and Jessamine Abel. Hugo Bovier.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Alexandre, for this presentation about the label Terre de Jeu. Yes, John, you mentioned a bureaucratic. I don't remember exactly the term you used, but that was bureaucratic something. And that's more my point of view about the Terre de Jeu label, because it's ultimately one page to fill out, and you see there's some obligation to do so for some territories. And this is actually what I saw, but I joined Alexandre to tell that we don't have enough feedback yet to see what will be the impact. About the question, we saw during the London 2012 Olympics in the north of France some new networks of stakeholders, from touristic, politics stakeholders, have been created to welcome Olympic delegations during that time. Are you aware about some projects like that for the 2024 Olympics? And if so, where? A quick word about Bretagne, maybe, it's my territory now. And do you see any competition between territories? Is there yes, some competition about that? And is there a form of obligation to do so, like I mentioned about the Terre de Jeu label? Is there, because it's the game, a city, a department, a whole region has to do something? Do you see stuff like that? Thank you. And sorry for my English again.
No problem. Concerning the center of preparation of the game, the condition to become a center of preparation of the games are much more important and much more stronger than for the label. You need to have good facilities as a high level, and you need to have not only sports facilities, but also services for the people. So hotel, restoration, local level transport service for the people, so taxi or something like that. You need to have a kind of environment that can help the delegation to have good training, and not all the candidates became a center of preparation of the game. I think there is only 450 center of preparation of the games for the one for near to 800 candidature. So there is a huge section in this way. And the north of France, yes, as you mentioned, was important during the Games of London, and the same network is now involved in the preparation of the games. But for Brittany, I think there is another point. It's the network of municipalities in terms of sport policy is more important than in the rest of France. So we need to have a better analysis of what happened in Brittany now about this center of preparation of the games public policy. I see in the comments that yes, Gustavo say, but there are so many municipalities with the label that it looks like it is only a way of making people feel included and support the event. I can also agree with that. It's from now we have no other analysis than this one. Jessamine, Abel, you want to have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering about or thinking about the disparity that you noticed between urban spaces and rural spaces, and that there was much more interest in the urban spaces than in rural areas. And you said, well, maybe rural areas were just not very interested. And when Professor de Laplace mentioned the phrase cultural proximity, that really struck me. And I thought, okay, is that kind of the core of what's going on? Is there, you know, that connection between cities that makes, you know, Tokyo and Paris have more in common than Tokyo and you know, some rural part of Japan. Then I think you kind of answered my question in your response to the previous question, because I was going to ask about maybe do rural places feel like they don't have the wherewithal to contribute, and can that explain the difference, or is there sort of maybe a cultural difference between urban and rural places, that urban places are ready to jump on something like this, whereas rural communities are kind of like, well, that's something for Paris, that's something for the cities, and don't even think of trying to contribute. Anyway, a long kind of summary of the question, since I've been going on and on, is sort of, do you have a sense of some kind of, any sense of the reason for that distinction, and is it maybe coming from some kind of cultural difference between spaces? Thanks.
In Paris region, the answer is easy, because there is a real link between the municipalities around Paris are in general huge municipalities with many inhabitants in relatively to what happened in France, and there is two networks. So one network is evident, it's all the ancient municipalities led by communists have strong public policy in terms of sport, and these urban municipalities were involved at the beginning in the promotion of the games. And that's another very interesting point. And these municipalities form a specific network, and because the games are organized in communist municipalities, so Saint-Denis in the north of Paris, socialist municipality, now it's not communist, but from the left side in general, this network was quickly involved in this process. In the rural area, it's very complex. I don't understand why. Perhaps the most evident is this question of facilities, that local rural area didn't have enough sport facilities to promote the sport at the same way that in urban area. And we can say at the same time that the Olympic Games have a specific sports to promote. So natation, no, swimming, sorry, swimming, some sport who need facilities, existing facilities, but not only a field or lake. They need huge facilities. And so I think the games promote sports that is easiest to practice in urban area, even if we speak about kayak or some very specific sport, but the most important sport are the one made when you have the facilities for. So perhaps the BA is this point, in the key point of the facilities that are not promoted. And I can say that the label Terre de Jeux at the beginning wanted to promote really the facilities and the renovation of facilities. And when we go in countryside in France, we see there's times many municipalities abandon their fields, sport fields or sport facilities, because the population is more and more older, and there is no reason to continue to spend money in these facilities. So there is a huge gap between rural and urban area on the question of facilities. And perhaps it is this point the most important to explain the difference between the central part of Paris and the outside. If there is any question, and I am in a strange position to be the moderator as at the same time the presenter. So I will cut my presentation now. And I see that Matthew Burbank is arrived at the office. Matthew Burbank, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Matthew, with my very French accent, it's beautiful Matthew that I say. So Matthew and Greg, thank you to be here. And I will now let the floor to you two for your presentation. Have you the possibility to share the presentation perhaps?
All right. So I think we are ready to get going.
Yes, absolutely. It's worked well and we heard you and we see your PowerPoint. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the organizers of this session for inviting us. We very much appreciate the chance to share our work. This work, I should note, is based upon the book that you see, Contesting the Olympics in American Cities. And that is something that is just recently published by Palgrave Macmillan. And so that's the basis for our presentation. So let's begin. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the introductory material and then two of our case studies. And then Greg will talk about Los Angeles, which will cover more heavily the content for the upcoming Olympic Games. So we will start with talking just a little bit about the American context. And what we wanted to note here is just that when we're talking about the nature of bidding for the Olympics in the United States, one of the things that we all need to keep in mind about the nature of that process is it's directed largely by local officials, and that those local officials, the power of those local officials depends heavily on the kind of nature of the context in the American states. And so just to note that states have their own constitutional structures. They share power between the US state and the federal government. And also that local government powers tend to vary sometimes quite dramatically between cities. So some cities have a great deal of control over their ability to tax and spend, for example, and their ability to control land use planning. Whereas other areas have less control over those, and those tend to be run more by state or in some cases by special governments. The point that we want to make, however, is that in virtually all American cities, right, trying to have a strong economy is something that is a primary objective. And so one of the ways of pursuing that, of course, is to engage in activities such as what we have in the past called the mega event strategy. And these strategies tend to be very heavily driven by the attempt to have consumption-oriented economic development, often luxury housing, and at times demand for larger and larger projects as things proceed. And we would also note that the nature of mega events are appealing to US cities primarily because they help cities to provide a timeline and in some cases resources that will help with both physical regeneration, but also very often kind of reimagining the nature of the city, sometimes simply putting a city on the map, metaphorically at least, and tends also to very heavily tend to favor the tourism and amenity orientations. The focus of our presentation here is on the changing nature of opposition to the Olympics in US cities. And the kind of theme that we've developed in this book, which is based on a series of case studies that we have done of Chicago, of Boston, and of Los Angeles. And again, Greg will speak in more detail about Los Angeles. I'll speak quickly about Chicago and Boston. But the changing nature of the opposition is that over the course of these three oppositions, what we have seen is a shift toward increased focus on inequalities within the city. This is something that previously we rarely saw in terms of opposition movements. Now we're seeing it become a prominent feature within opposition movements. A sharing of knowledge, both locally, but also very prominently with people in other cities and often internationally as well. And a change to the narrative. And that narrative really is largely about trying to focus on these questions of economic development, who benefits, who does not benefit, and that the fact that very often that both the nature of the policy process and the nature of the outcomes of that policy process are often directed in such a way that the Olympics are benefited and many other kind of key players also get a benefit, but that residents of cities often are not terribly benefited by this process. And so, as I said, the way that we've approached this is to look at, in some depth, at the opposition, both the bid process and the opposition within these Olympic cities of Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles. Chicago and Boston, of course, had failed bids for the Olympic. Los Angeles has the upcoming Olympics. And so we'll focus on these three cities as the basis for our discussion about the nature of changing opposition. So in terms of looking at Chicago's bid for the 2016 games, which again, ultimately they lost out in the IOC voting to Rio de Janeiro. But Chicago's bid for the 2016 games is kind of a classic, what we refer to as a mega event strategy, right? In the sense that this was a city that really lacked resources to pull this off on its own, and yet began to go down this path largely because it was looking for ways to kind of change the dynamic of how development was done, particularly in downtown Chicago. The bid focused heavily on kind of certain areas within Chicago, and within those areas, there was an attempt to try to kind of change the nature of that development policy within the city of Chicago. And the city, again, lacked the resources to kind of pull this development off on its own, but much of their proposal in terms of the bid was to be financed by something known as tax increment financing, which in a simple way is simply to say that the taxes will be based on the increases of the value of property over time. And so is a way of essentially borrowing money in advance and paying it off later by using these increased tax revenues. This is always a bit controversial, but Chicago went very heavily for this approach to thinking about development. Within Chicago, the political and economic elite saw the Olympics as a way to kind of reframe the city's image, to think about pulling off a big development, and that this was something that was appealing, particularly to the mayor's office, and again, members of the people who supported the mayor within the city of Chicago. And so it was very much kind of a classic effort to use the Olympics as a way to kind of reframe the nature of development in Chicago. Opposition to the bid in Chicago didn't begin immediately with the bid process, but it developed gradually over time. The primary source of opposition was a group known as No Game Chicago. And No Game Chicago was, interestingly, an avowedly anti-Olympics group. They did not like the Olympics. They didn't like the IOC. They did not like the approach that the city was taking to the games. They also had a whole set of other concerns, and these were kind of carefully included as part of their opposition message. But the fact that they were kind of avowedly anti-Olympics is really one of the first times that we see this in a US political context. Generally, what we have seen previously is that people don't oppose the Olympics, they only oppose certain development plans. And here was a group in a major US city that was saying essentially, we don't think the Olympics is a good development strategy. We also have grave worries about how these resources are going to be distributed. And as a result, they were, again, kind of became the primary opposition to the bid within the city of Chicago. There were also a number of neighborhood organizations, primarily on the south side of Chicago. Their concerns, however, were not so much anti-Olympics. They were much more focused on simply saying that we want to get some benefits out of this. We don't want to see our areas of the city be gentrified. What we do want to see are some benefits that will help current residents. And so their opposition, while at times important in this process, was nowhere near as consistent as No Game Chicago. And so they were, again, sort of on the same side as No Game Chicago, but didn't always use the same approach to opposition. One of the points you want to note about No Game Chicago is they used extensive research and really worked hard to try to develop innovative approaches. One of the things that they did was they went to IOC meetings. Again, we'd never really seen opposition groups do this before. They went to IOC meetings and campaigned against Chicago getting the bid. Again, this was a very kind of unexpected thing to see, but they used it quite well. And again, relying heavily here on media coverage of this to amplify their message. And so they developed some innovative tactics. They also developed some fairly extensive connections to people in other organizations, or excuse me, in other cities, primarily in Vancouver and in London for the 2012 Olympics, and also later on opponents in Rio de Janeiro as well. In Boston, what we saw was something that was, it was a bid process that really began as kind of an amateur effort to support the city by kind of featuring the games and saying, you know, people who wanted to show off Boston as a nice place to live. But that very quickly was taken over by people who were interested more in large scale development. The Boston Bid Committee, when it formed, was run largely by people who were either involved in the development process in the city of Boston, or there were people who were closely connected to sports organizations. And so the primary driving force there was really the developers as part of that bid process. It was a bid that did not feature a great deal of detail. They, again, essentially following the United States Olympic Committee's advice, did not provide a lot of detail in the bid process, but they did initially get the selection by the USOC. This was in January in 2015, and then very shortly thereafter, by August, they had withdrawn that bid. So it was a very kind of short-lived bid process. They never got to the process of actually competing at the IOC stage. But what was interesting for us in this way is that, again, this became very much a kind of mega event strategy by developers. And eventually when Boston withdrew, then LA became the choice for the USOC. And Greg will talk more about that process coming up here in just a moment. But within Boston, what we saw was opposition to the bid process. And this began relatively quickly. As soon as the bid sort of became a serious endeavor, we saw opposition, and there were kind of two main opposition groups in Boston. One was No Boston Olympics, which was a group that primarily was policy activists, for lack of a better term, people who were really opposed to the Olympics because they saw public finance and the public policy process really as not playing out in the way that they thought it should. And a second group, No Boston 2024, was a more grassroots organization. And they were a group that, for the most part, again, were primarily concerned with the impacts on their neighborhood. They began in a neighborhood of Boston known as Jamaica Plain, but also included people from other neighborhoods as well. But these were people who were already being kind of hard pressed by Boston's growth. And so they were very much opposed to, again, kind of continued gentrification of the area. These two groups, even though they were quite different, actually worked together quite well. They didn't coordinate all their activities, but they sort of took different paths. No Boston Olympics tended to focus on a heavy social media presence, a very strong amount of presence in the traditional media, lots of presentations in the paper, presentations in local media, and used that to get their message out. It became kind of the face of the opposition within the debate in Boston. No Boston 2024, on the other hand, tended to stage events. They tended to do protests. They tended to have kind of noisy opposition. But again, those two kind of nicely complemented each other, even though it wasn't really a coordinated strategy. And what we saw in both was, again, heavy use of social media to get their message out, and also fairly strong contacts with organizations in other cities, other opposition groups. And so again, this is a theme I think that we saw throughout the course of the book, is that a number of opposition groups developed these ways to try to oppose the Olympics and try to coordinate with people in other cities. And at that, I will turn it over to Greg to talk more about what's happening in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Matt. And as Matt said, we thank everybody for all the organizers and everybody who's been attending these meetings. I have ambient light coming through the window because we're just at sunrise here in Los Angeles. And so rather than having the artificial light, I have the other light on. Volume's okay, yes? Matt, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So we thank everybody. And just to jump into Los Angeles. So Los Angeles, as some of the, I think probably was discussed in some of the earlier parts of this conference, Los Angeles is one of the cities that's hosted the Olympics in the past. And Los Angeles has developed its own approach to hosting the Olympics. And this approach has been outside of local government. And as Matt said, and I'll just reiterate, in the United States, Olympic bids tend to be run locally, not by the national government or by some other official organ of government. And so in Los Angeles, in particular, the bid process has always been kept far from the reach of local government. It's been characterized not only as being privately organized, but by using existing facilities to the point that it can, and to get all of the funding lined up well in advance. So the third component of the LA bid strategy has been to use a very low-profile public persona for the bid committee during the bid process. So as much as possible, these guys try to stay out of the public eye. When the bid was launched, the third bullet on this, when the bid was launched for the 2024 Olympics, it was in at a time of uncertainty. The three bids that we cover in this book really are in a period where the United States was not United States bids were not well received internationally because there was a dispute over revenues at the IOC level. And by the time that the revenue dispute got resolved, the Chicago bid had already gone through the process. The Boston and Los Angeles bids for 2024 were sort of unfolding after the USOC, the U.S. Olympic Committee, decided that the U.S. should in fact field a bid, after the IOC said you guys should field a bid. And so in 2013, 2014, when the USOC was putting together the idea for 2024, they sent a letter out to 35 mayors in large American cities asking, do you have any interest in fielding the bid? And LA was the first city to respond to this. And the mayor at the time, Antonio Villaraigosa, said, well, you know, of course we are. And then he quickly went out of office, and the mayor that followed him, Eric Garcetti, our current mayor, said, you know, yes, we're still interested. And then due to internal politics in the USOC, there were some issues between Boston and Los Angeles, but when Boston stepped out and Los Angeles stepped in, this was the big opportunity. However, the challenge was for the IOC at that time was that, as everybody who's participating in this knows, was that every other city seemed to drop out of contention. And so the IOC, in revising its bidding guidelines, selected Paris for 2024 and gave Los Angeles 2028, along with, you know, some cash, as they say. And so currently, when we look at Los Angeles and what it's doing, the last bullet on this slide points to the large part of the Los Angeles strategy, and that is we want to host the Olympics. We're fortunate enough to have a serious sports and amenity infrastructure already in the city and the region that's putting $6 billion into the local economy. And so we're not going to build anything new. And so they call it a no-build Olympics. The problem with that, of course, is that in order to put on an event like the Olympics, you have to have a fairly robust infrastructure. And so what we've seen is that once Los Angeles was given the games, all of these projects all of a sudden were green lighted for completion. The problem, there were two problems. One was the financial crisis of the subprime mortgages had already affected the local economy in a serious way, and cities were in the process of trying to recover from that. And then, of course, the second problem has been COVID, which kicked in 2020. And so we can see that, you know, a few years ago, private construction permits were up in a large way. They're still up. And one of the local consulting companies looking at construction, in large scale construction and commercial infrastructure, noted that there was a huge interest in the US and also by foreign investors, as we say over here, for acquiring trophy assets. And so trophy assets tend to be in the luxury and high value added amenity market. In addition, in Los Angeles, we've been fighting for years about trying to do something about the number of cars that we have. And it's been a losing battle here in Los Angeles, but the LA County Metropolitan Transit Authority, for example, with the announcement of the Olympics coming in 2028, had a decade-long window to try to get some of its strategic vision for infrastructure development moving forward. And so they had a 28 for 28 set of projects to deal with demand management, all this technical stuff that we're probably not that interested in, but it basically included expanding 2 light rail systems and building 2 more light rail systems. And of course, we're not sure where all of this is today, but they are moving forward with some of these plans. Matt, can I move these slides forward, or do you have to?
I did it.
Thank you. And so that really takes us into the question of opposition. At the time of the bid, there was not really an organized opposition in Los Angeles. And then when the USOC selected Boston, everything calmed down, such as it was in the city. And then all of a sudden, everything changed when the IOC said, well, you know, and it was leaked to the news, that Los Angeles was in fact a candidate for 2028, which would not have its own bidding process. And so this was something new and different, and a new group formed almost immediately at that moment, calling itself No Olympics LA. This group came out of a progressive, in the United States, left-wing group that was working originally around the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in an earlier life, but is still actively involved in politics at all levels, federal, state, and local in the United States. And what they decided was that the work that they were doing, focusing on economic inequalities, could be furthered by focusing on the Olympics, using the Olympics as a way of highlighting socio-spatial inequalities in cities. And so they were particularly interested, when we talk about socio-spatial inequalities here, they were particularly interested in the lack of affordable housing. They were interested in the growing ranks of homeless people in Los Angeles and around the country. And they were concerned about what was happening with policing. The fact that police forces in the United States were becoming highly militarized, and that the idea of securitization as part of any urbanism projects was going to be put front and central from this point on. And so those were their major concerns, and the issues that they tried to raise have been around these things. They've also hooked up with about 30 other local community organizations who are working on these issues, and they've used a variety of different techniques, from more traditional protests, rallies, teach-ins, things like that, to using a lot of social media to try to highlight what their issues are, how they fit into specific neighborhoods, and what the community can do, community members can do to participate. And so this means that a lot of this stuff is available in both English and Spanish here in Los Angeles. No Olympics LA has continued down the track that the previous two bid cities, American bid cities, Chicago and Boston, pioneered and developed, and that is they've developed extensive transnational ties. And one of the benefits that they've seen is that because we have a 10-year period in Los Angeles to have a conversation about what the city is, this is allowing them to get hooked up with activists all over the place, Tokyo, Paris. Prior to Tokyo, the Winter Games at Pyeongchang. They have extensive ties in Rio and London, and working on things with Beijing at the moment, the Winter Games that are coming up in Europe, and also, Matt, in whatever's going to happen, they think, in Salt Lake City with a future upcoming Winter Games. And so for this 10-year conversation, one of the novelties, unlike the opposition in previous bids, is that there is an Olympics every 2 years, which allows all of these issues to be raised once again. Matt, if you can advance me. Okay, so let me hit our conclusion, and then I'll do some more on Los Angeles. So from a public policy perspective, which is where we started out, when we look at contesting Olympic urbanism and what the evidence suggests from the 3 cities that we've looked at, we see that on the 3 points that we've identified, that it does suggest, to us at least, that there is an emergence of a broader resistance to IOC's model. And as the question and answer session went to John Lauermann's discussion a little earlier, I'll say this morning over here, but today for everybody else, or this evening, depending on where you are, I guess. One of the things that that really is being raised is this issue of how will the IOC respond? And the IOC's bid process is in flux. It's going to remain in flux for a while. John said that he thought that in general the IOC was looking for good outcomes, and of course the challenge is, as John said, that when you look at things like right to the city, which is what all of these opposition and resistance groups against the Olympics are focused on, that both right and city have to be questioned. And so when we look at what the opposition groups have tried to do, they've tried to really shift the focus of the discussion to include sociospatial inequalities in any discussion of Olympic urbanism. Their argument is that if the UOC, as a proxy for the IOC, is going to go around saying that there are all these great transformative benefits for cities if you bid for the games, but you have to have so many hotel rooms, you have to have this type of an airport that can handle international travel, you have to have this type of a transportation system, and so on and so forth, that you can't say that on the one hand and then say, but none of these things really have anything to do with hosting the Olympics. That's really something that the city should have in place. The IOC perhaps is now looking at maybe some of this is in fact important because of the amount of opposition and resistance that we're seeing in cities. So, have the opposition groups been able to make this part of the discussion of Olympic urbanism? We would suggest they have. May not be the central point, but it is a point. Sharing the knowledge, the second thing we were looking at, there is a more continuous contestation, it seems to us, developing. We'll see what happens in the future. But certainly this continuous contestation, being able to focus every 2 years on an Olympics, having a network of people who are involved in discussions, using similar materials, sharing knowledge about how to approach things as everything evolves. This is all something that is new, different, and from a public policy standpoint, perhaps worrisome. And then, of course, the challenge of changing the narrative begins with focusing on, public awareness. What are people really paying attention to? In Los Angeles, before the IOC awarded the games, they did their own polling to find out what was public opinion like in Los Angeles. And this is on top of a poll that was done, commissioned by the bid committee, done by Loyola Marymount University right down the street from where I'm speaking right now in my apartment. And both of these showed more than 3/4 of respondents being in favor of the games. And when No Olympics LA started, one of their initial tactics was to do their own public opinion survey. And they asked a series of additional questions not asked by LMU, and we don't know what the IOC asked. We only know what their results were. But they asked one very interesting question, are you following this Olympic debate right now? This idea that Los Angeles is bidding, and a minuscule number of respondents were even following this. Most people, it was not on their horizon of issues that were in front of them. So how do you build this public awareness? to get community voices involved in these discussions. If there is going to be a right to the city, and that right is going to be expressed out of the community, then the community has to be able to participate. And so how do you build that public awareness for people to be involved? Urban economic development, as has been pointed out, is a fairly arcane public policy area. As we noted on Chicago, and I'm sure John Lauermann noted, the area is really filled with all sorts of very tricky fiscal and financial policy tools that most people don't really understand and most people aren't involved with. And most of these tools are actually implemented in ways that preclude broad public involvement. So even though there's a planning process in cities where theoretically public voice can be heard and some of this awareness can be developed, the reality is that many of the decisions are made and they're made in venues that are further removed from public scrutiny. And this, of course, means who is the public policy answering to? And of course, it's answering to investors. It's answering to insurance companies. It's answering to the people who are fronting money in many of these schemes. And the interests of realizing a profit, higher rents, higher profits, is generally not something that involves any sort of discussion with community members, particularly in communities that have been identified as undervalorized. And these are places where if you can invest and you can upgrade, your ability to realize a profit is much higher. And if you can move toward a larger scale development, if we go back to the second or third slide, Matt, can you go back to that one? That one. If we look at what's going on at the bottom of this, mega events provide a timeline and focus for urban reimaging, physical regeneration, and building a tourism and amenity orientation. So selective infrastructure, larger scale redevelopment, increased securitization to protect private property. And of course, who's going to be involved in this? There's going to be a much enhanced role for business elites. And who's not going to be involved in this? There's going to be diminished opportunities for community members. And so this becomes the challenge for all of these opposition groups. In a bid cycle of 9 months, you have a different strategy and tactics than you do over a 10-year period, clearly. And so we're continuing to see how all of this unfolds in Los Angeles. And so just to update you on Los Angeles, my notes fell onto the floor. But in the last week, we've had what we'll call a significant development here in Los Angeles. And that development is that the city council, the Los Angeles City Council, has approved the games agreement with the organizing committee. And what the Los Angeles City Council did was it established, when the games were awarded to Los Angeles, the LA City Council established an ad hoc committee on the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Just to go back in time a few years, when Boston dropped out of the bidding process, and in the couple of months that the US Olympic Committee decided to select Los Angeles to replace Boston, the LA City Council had to reapprove all the documentation for the bid for 2024, which it did without any debate. And then when the IOC awarded the games for 2028, all of the documentation had to be updated from 2024 to 2028. And so the Los Angeles City Council approved all of that, basically without debate. At that time, there were members of No Olympics LA present in the City Council meeting arguing that you don't have to approve this today. 2028 is years away. Why not have some hearings and actually discuss this? But the IOC had put a short timeline on approving this because they wanted to make the announcement in their upcoming meeting. And this meant that all the, Paris and Los Angeles had to approve everything and have all the ducks in a row very quickly. And so for Los Angeles, this again meant, changing dates, changing conditions. When they submitted it, they really didn't even have a budget in the city of Los Angeles, for the city of Los Angeles to consider. And so the city set up an ad hoc committee that would periodically review all of these Olympic activities for 2028. So on the 29th of November, Monday, a week ago, the ad hoc committee met, and in about a 2-hour meeting, they discussed the games agreement. Casey Wasserman, who's one of the leaders, we'll call him a co-chair for the LA 2028 organizing committee, was there and answered questions. And this is really the first time that there's been any sort of a public question and answer session involving the City Council, LA 2028, and the city's negotiators with 2028. And so over a couple of hours, they talked about what was important and what could happen. And just to provide a quick summary of that, the three things that were discussed in terms of question and answer over this period were, could the city of Los Angeles avoid financial risks? And this is always what the city of Los Angeles is about. Second thing that was discussed was, how are we going to address contracting opportunities for local businesses as we move closer to the 2028 games? This was a big problem, of course, in Atlanta in 1996. And this has been an issue in many Olympic cities. How do we get local businesses to provide jobs for residents in all of this? And so then the third piece of that is, of course, the jobs for local residents, whether this can happen. And so these things sort of, are sort of on the line of how the LA 2028 committee addresses its concerns. What did they submit to the City Council with this agreement? They submitted a fiscal impact statement. They did not submit any sort of financial policy statements, and they did not submit any sort of a community impact statement. And so when we look at what are they interested in, really the issue for LA City Council representing the people of Los Angeles is fiscal risk. That's the issue that they're concerned with. They're not, at least in terms of where they're moving, they're not really concerned with what's happening in any of the communities.
Dear Greg, I'm sorry, we need to conclude because we have the round table in 15 minutes and I need to move of building. So this is not easy for me. Do you have one sentence, please? You can conclude.
I have a long sentence.
Perfect.
So in conclusion, what Casey Wasserman said summarizes the challenges that are facing opposition groups. And let me read you this long sentence. We have no requirements, he says, for new venues, no requirements for additional infrastructure, no requirements for additional hotel rooms. Everything we need is in place today. It was in place when we put our bid in 2016, and we can deliver that today. Furthermore, as we sit here today, with well over half our revenue contracted already, we are prepared to deliver the games with the revenue we have today. So that's the challenge. In Los Angeles, Olympic urbanism still refuses in the local committee to deal with these larger socio-spatial inequalities. There are 2 city council members that are raising questions that are also raised by the opposition, 2 out of 15. Thank you, sorry.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Matthew, for this presentation. It was amazing, and I know that we have 3 hands up. Unfortunately, we need to cut our computer in 1 minute because we need to move and to change of a room and of building. I'm very sorry about that, so we don't have the time to speak now. It's in fact we need to. Initially, we have organized to have all in the same room, but because of the COVID, we need to change of building. So I'm very sorry of that. So I need to move now. We have the roundtable in 15 minutes. It was amazing, and we will continue to talk about that. And this meeting started in Paris at 9 in the morning, and we finish at 9 in the morning in Los Angeles. This is perfect for the transition between the 2 cities. And I'm sorry, Hugo, I'm sorry, John and Filippo, for your question, but we need to move. We will exchange the email address, and like that, we will continue to talk about that. Thank you, everybody, for this very good and nice presentation. Thank you to be so early in the morning in your computer. And we will. You have the possibility to watch the roundtable, but it is in French, unfortunately, in the YouTube link that you have in the chat. And thank you, and we will absolutely continue this discussion with everybody. Have a good day. Have a good day in US, and have a good evening in France for the next. And thank you again. I'm sorry for the discussion. We stop now.
Thanks, Alexandre, for organizing. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks, everybody, for talking.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.